This presentation will give you an overview of the ThingWorx orchestration platform and specifically the connectors. The primary audience for this presentation are developers who have been tasked with building a connector for a new system. We will cover the following items. We will take a look at ThingWorx Flow. We will look at connector basics, the artifacts that are required to build connectors, and then we'll take a look at how one goes about building a custom connector. Before we go into building custom connectors, let's first try to understand what ThingWorx Flow does. It is a system that is built using Node.js, and it has a microservice based architecture. It allows you to connect your devices and enterprise systems together and integrate them using flows. And you can exchange data between various disparate systems. Out of the box, it comes with 50 plus connectors for various software as a service applications. And of course, it already has connectors for PTC products like ThingWorx, Windchill, and Integrity. The solution can be deployed in the cloud or on premise. At a very high level, the various components of the solution are ThingWorx, which allows you to source data from various physical devices and store them as a thing model. The orchestration microservices are components that are used for building the flows and for actually running them. The connectors are what allow you to interact with different applications. And to build custom connectors, you would use a connector development environment, which is a set of tools and a SDK. Now let's take a look at connectors. A connector is a component that allows ThingWorx Flow to connect with external services. From a code perspective, a connector can be considered as a specialized NPM package. And some examples of connectors that are available out of the box are Box and Dropbox, which allow you to store and download files from those applications. Connectors are available for various Google apps like Gmail, Google Forms, Tasks, and so on. PTC apps like ThingWorx, Windchill, Integrity all have their own connectors. And in addition to this, you can build a custom connector for your own application. Connectors have various artifacts. Every connector or every application that we connect to needs some sort of authentication. Orchestration supports OAuth, and for systems that do not support OAuth, connections can be used. We will look at actions, lookups, triggers, etc. in detail. But in addition to these artifacts, there are some miscellaneous artifacts that are contained in the connector, and these are icons and localization and metadata that describes each of these artifacts. So let's take a quick look at what connections are. So for all subsystems that do not support OAuth, a connection needs to be authored. And the advantages of having connections are they work out of the box because they require little to no configuration. It is typically used for mechanisms like HTTP basic authentication or application key. Let's take a look at connections in action. So to begin with, I'm going to create a new workflow. I'll give it name and some description, and I'll save it. On the right hand side here, you see a list of various connectors, and if we click on the down arrow, we see the various actions that are supported in the connector. If we Now let's pick up one of those connectors which require a connection. So Jira is one of the connectors which requires a connection. We drag and drop the create comment action, If I click on the settings icon, I'll see the various input fields for this particular action. And the important field here is the connection to Jira. This drop down typically shows you an add new item. That is, if you do not want to use one of the connections that you created previously, you can click on add new. The label is common to all connection dialog boxes, and this is a way to name your connections. You provide the password, the username, and you can see that they are all required fields. And in some cases, basic authentication also needs the URL that is specific to your organization. So in this case, it is thingworx.jira.com. And once I hit on the add button, the system is going to try and validate this connection. And if the connection validates, the connection gets added to this list. The connections that we create here can be shared across various actions in the same flow, or you could, if required, create a different connection for each action. Once you have created your connection, if you need to validate it, you can just hit on the test button, and that's pretty much it. So if we look at this connection, you see these various inputs, and these are rendered because of the input schema that was specified when building this connection or the connector. Now let's move on to the next important artifact, which is an OAuth. Many SaaS applications support OAuth based authentication. As an example, we'll take the box connector. We'll select the create folder action here, and when I hit on the settings, I see the same kind of UI with various fields, and connection needs to be provided. However, in this case, it is an OAuth based collection, which you can tell from the label here, add new box logging. You click on it, and it takes you directly to the authorized URL that has been specified for this particular OAuth configuration. You provide your username and password here, and once you click on authorize, your credentials will be validated by the box OAuth provider. Note that it says here that once we click on authorize, we'll be granting access to this particular application. The name of this application here is ThingWorx Flow. We'll be authorizing ThingWorx Flow to perform actions on our behalf, and you can see the various permissions that this application will get once we grant it access. Once the credentials are validated, it will prompt you for name for this particular authentication. Let's call it box new and click on add, and you can see that the OAuth credentials were validated. You can again hit on the test button to validate the OAuth, and that is pretty much all there is to OAuth. Now before we create these OAuths, they require some amount of initial configuration and data loading. And a reason for this is every SaaS application will require you to create an application on their website or on the OAuth provider. And typical information like client ID and secrets are generated at that time. Sometimes you have to provide additional information like domains, organizations. You have to provide redirect URL. You'll find all the documentation about creating OAuth configurations in the SDK guide and the installation guide. URLs vary for provider, and hence in many cases we have to actually change the URLs in the configuration. Every OAuth provider will have their own kind of URLs for authorizing a user, for generating tokens, or for validating the tokens, and so on. ThingWorx Flow supports both OAuth version 1 and version 2. The thing with OAuths is that they require this initial configuration, so none of these OAuths are available out of the box. The next thing we are going to look at is our actions. Now, actions require you to specify some sort of authentication, and every action will have an input for specifying the connection to use, or OAuth, or one of them. For actions, one has to specify the input and output schema while developing the action, and this schema is used to render the form fields for the actions. Actions can also refer to lookups, which will help populate some fields in the form. And actions should typically execute quickly and should not run for too long. That way, the entire flow can execute within the stipulated time. Let's take a quick look at actions before we move on to the next one. So here we already have a create folder action that is open, and every action will have this label field here, which you can use to specify a name for this instance of the action. So in this case, we'll call it CF1. We'll select one of these authentications that we have created. We can test it out. You can see here that there is a folder name field, and this was rendered because it is specified in the input schema for this action. And then there is this additional drop down field, which is populated from the values of executing a lookup. So this particular one is showing me all the various folders that I have on box. And then I hit on done. The next thing that we do when we use a flow is to feed the output of one action into another action. So let's choose a simple action here called JSON stringify. And what we are trying to do here is stringify the output that is produced by this box create folder action. To do this, we would simply connect the action to another action. Now, when we open up the settings for the JSON stringify action, on the right hand side, we see various inputs that are already populated for us. This input for any action shows all the actions that can possibly happen before it, and this can be used to provide the inputs for various fields on this action. So in this case, the inputs show all the output that is generated by the create folder action of box, and we can hit done. Now the next thing we are going to look at are lookups, and they are related to actions as well as triggers. The primary use for lookups is to render drop-down lists. The values present in the lookups can be generated from hard-coded enumerations written in the metadata file, or they can be actually populated dynamically by making requests to your application. These lookups, when they execute, can use the values that are already filled in the form, and they typically will also need the authentication that the same authentication as the action. So when the lookup is executed, the authentication information and values of all other fields are fed into the lookup, and the lookup can use those to query the application. The primary use for lookups is when the set of values acceptable for the input field are too large or they're hard to remember. One example of displaying a lookup is, let's say you have a field for the names of countries. The list of names of countries is not that large, so it can probably be listed as an enumeration. But let's say you wanted to render all the cities or the states in this particular country, you would have to query some service, and given a country, it would produce the number, the list of cities and states in that particular country. So those are two use cases for lookups. Lookups also supports a number of advanced use cases like the ability to change the schema of a form based on the selections in the list. For now, let's take a look at one of the lookups for the box action. So you see this parent folder here. I can either provide a value directly, or I can have uh, the lookup executed, and you can see that the lookup is listing all the files after connecting to the box server. And if there are more files than can be shown on the screen, you would see a load more option. All of this is controlled via the Node.js code written in the connector. You can also see that it is possible to navigate through hierarchies by drilling down into them. In this particular case, this folder has no subfolders, and hence that is what gets shown. One thing to note about lookups is that they are executed only at design time, that is when I'm editing this form. However, actions can be executed in the background, are always executed in the background. The next thing we'll look at are triggers. So trigger is a mechanism used to initiate flow execution based on occurrence of events. These events usually happen inside the SaaS service or an application. So triggers will typically have an input where you would first select the event that needs to be handled, and based on the events, the schema would render the various inputs required to configure the event. Triggers can be associated with one or more flows. There are two types of triggers. One is the polling trigger, which, as the name suggests, will execute every few minutes or seconds. Such triggers will basically compare the current objects present in your system to a snapshot that was taken previously. And if there is a change in the objects there, it would initiate the flow execution. Webhooks are different in that you have to actually register with the application and tell it that you would be interested in listening to one of those events. Along with the event information and other data, you also have to provide the URL callback, which the service will use to initiate the flow. Now, for this reason, testing of webhook requires that your system have either a static address, or it should be made available via some sort of tunneling. One of the applications that are typically used for testing on developer systems is a tunnel, and there is a software called as ngrok, which you can find very useful for these situations. The next thing that we'll look at, now that we have seen the various important artifacts that a connector can contain, let's take a look at how one would go about building a custom connector. First, let's look at what tools are required. So in order to build a connector, you will need to have the Node.js application or programming language installed on your system. It needs to be the 8.9.4 LTS version, that is the long-term support. And it comes with the Node package manager, which is used to install additional required packages. You will also typically need an IDE. Visual Studio Code is an open source IDE which is available free of cost. WebStorm is also a very nice IDE but has a license. In addition to that, you would download certain packages from npmjs.org. So one such package is the Flow SDK, which is required in every connector. The CLI contains tools for creating the various artifacts in a connector and a connector project, and also for testing the various artifacts once you author them. And Flow Deploy is a tool that is very handy on on-premise installations for quickly deploying and verifying your connector inside the on-premise installation. This is optional. The tools are quite self-sufficient and they will allow you to test various actions, triggers, and lookups without actually having to deploy the connector on any kind of orchestration server. But in order to do integration testing along with various other connectors, you would need a on-premise installation. The process of building a connector goes as follows. You first have to decide and identify the mechanism you would use to authenticate with your chosen application. This could be HTTP basic, it could be OAuth, or it could be app key, or some new mechanism altogether. You would also have to find out if you can support a triggering mechanism. It could be polling based on looking at the state of the objects in the system, or it could be a webhook mechanism. You will need to identify all the actions, decide on the input and output formats. Input and outputs for the connector are typically JSON or are always JSON. However, you do have the choice of selecting the schema for the input and outputs. The next thing you do is you use the CLI to add the artifacts and test them using various commands. Once you're done with that, you might want to use the PTC test helpers to automate testing so that you can prevent any regressions in your code. And if you have an on-premise installation, you can actually deploy the connector and test it out on a server.